Charlotte District Court smelled like dust and paper when my father stood up, his hand shaking, but his voice sharp enough to cut air. "She's been hiding money from the family trust," he shouted. The room stiffened. Cameras clicked. I sat still. My father's lawyer smiled as if this were a rehearsed play. Then Lydia, my daughter-in-law, dabbed her eyes with a silk tissue and leaned toward the microphone. "We only want fairness," she said softly, her lashes trembling like she had practiced in a mirror. I almost admired her timing. The judge looked at me as if I were expected to crumble, but I had already rehearsed something too. I unlocked my iPad, pressed play, and turned the screen toward the courtroom monitor. The photo filled the wall, Lydia in a boutique holding a new beige Chanel bag. Her caption, "Bold and stupid. Paid in full. Thanks, Gerald." The gallery gasped. Lydia froze her mouth open, but no sound. My father's jaw tightened, his eyes darting toward the judge who suddenly reached for his glasses. The same judge who had shared golf weekends with my father, the same man who once told me privately that family disputes should be settled quietly. He cleared his throat. "Ms. Cross, where did you obtain this photo?" "Publicly," I said. "She posted it while claiming she was broke." For a second, the silence was so clean I could hear my own pulse. Gerald's lawyer whispered something about manipulation, but the word died in his throat when the monitor switched again to a screenshot of the payment transfer, $40,000 withdrawn from the trust 2 days before Lydia's shopping spree. The room rippled. My father muttered, "That's taken out of context." The judge raised his hand. "We'll recess for verification." His voice had lost its calm. Reporters scribbled. I closed the iPad and looked at my father. He still had that practiced authority in his posture, but his eyes had aged decades in a minute. I remembered the first time he taught me how to count money. I was 10. He poured coins onto the table and said, "A real cross never loses track." At the time, I thought he was teaching math. I did not know he was building a religion. When he accused me of hiding money, I realized he was angry because I had mastered the only faith he believed in: control. Lydia tried to stand, but her chair caught the hem of her dress. It tilted. She stumbled, muttering something about misunderstanding her tears, now real and messy. The judge had already left the bench. My father grabbed her wrist, whispering, "Stop crying." His voice cracked on the last word. Cameras kept flashing. A guard stepped closer, murmuring about order in the court. I sat perfectly still. It was the first time in my life I didn't flinch when my father raised his voice. "You think you're clever," he said across the silence. "You think this proves anything? It proves math still works?" I answered. I did not smile. The clerk approached to collect the exhibits, glancing at me like she wasn't sure whether to pity or salute me. I felt neither pride nor relief, only a strange balance, like watching a pendulum swing exactly back to center. Outside the windows, Charlotte's afternoon light struck the courthouse glass, sharp and colorless. I thought of my husband Charles, gone 4 years now, the only person who had ever told me that silence could be louder than shouting. I wondered if he would have enjoyed this symmetry. Lydia kept wiping her face, whispering to my father. "She set us up." I didn't. I simply stopped apologizing for being observant. My father had built his company by auditing everyone else's numbers, everyone except his own. When he pointed at me in that courtroom accusing me of theft, I realized that finger had been pointing my whole life. I just finally turned it back. A reporter shouted, "Ms. Cross, will you respond to the allegation?" I stood, adjusted my blazer, and said, "He once taught me to count every dollar. He never imagined I'd count his." The flashbulbs popped again. The court officer gestured toward the hallway, but I didn't move until my father sat down, the authority drained from his shoulders. Lydia's phone buzzed on the table notifications stacking under the photo I had just shown. I left it ringing. As I walked out, the echo of heels followed like punctuation. Outside, the crowd murmured, part gossip, part sympathy. I heard a woman whisper, "That's justice." I didn't turn. I wasn't here to make noise. I was here to balance the ledger. Later, when I passed the courthouse steps, someone asked if I planned to reconcile with my father. I said, "You can reconcile with mistakes, not with patterns." The wind lifted my hair as I stepped into the sun. My phone vibrated messages, speculation headlines forming. I smiled just enough for one camera to catch it. "Would you expose a family member like this?" I said quietly, knowing they'd record it anyway, "or would you stay silent?" I was 10 the first time my father made me pay an electric bill. He spread the papers across the kitchen table and said, "If you live in this house, you should know what it costs to keep the lights on." He gave me a yellow notepad, a calculator, and a pencil already sharpened to a threat. My mother tried to interrupt, but he lifted a hand without looking at her. That gesture was enough. So I sat there dividing kilowatt hours by days, adding tax, then writing the total in perfect columns. When I finished, he nodded and said, "Now sign it." I asked, "Why would I sign a bill?" He smiled like a teacher grading a test. "So you learn that everything has your name on it." For years, I thought that lesson was about responsibility. Later, I understood it was about ownership and that he never meant to share it. When I got a full scholarship to Duke, I thought maybe I had finally earned a kind of respect. I showed him the letter while he sat in his office, surrounded by trophies of himself. He didn't even look up. "If you were a son," he said, "you'd be running my company by now." I laughed because the silence after such words needed somewhere to go. I learned to smile while people mistook that for permission. That was the first survival skill he ever taught me, without knowing it. At Duke, I met Charles. He was quiet, a mechanical engineer who loved to cook. He never bragged about his work, which confused me at first. My father measured men by volume. Charles measured them by consistency. The first time they met, Gerald asked what Charles made per year. Charles said, "Enough to buy dinner tonight." My father didn't laugh, but I did. That night I realized I could love a man who didn't flinch in my father's shadow. When we married, my father sent a white envelope with a note that said, "Congratulations on the merger," and inside a check written for $0. The memo line read, "To remind you that love does not pay bills." Charles framed it and hung it behind our pantry door. Every time I opened it, I saw his handwriting underneath "Correction." Partnership does. My mother whispered that I should be grateful my father even attended the wedding. I was, until he gave his speech. "A cross-family woman knows her place," he said into the microphone. The crowd chuckled, thinking it was a joke. Charles took my hand under the table, his thumb tracing calm circles on my palm. I smiled again, that same practiced smile from childhood, only this time I added something new behind it: calculation. The morning after the wedding, while my father nursed a hangover and dictated messages to his assistant, I walked into his office at Cross Steel. He kept a heavy brass company seal on his desk, the symbol of every document, every deal, every ounce of control he believed only he could grant. I looked at it for a long time, then slipped it into the bottom of my jewelry box wrapped in tissue paper. He would spend 3 weeks tearing apart the office looking for it. The company halted shipments because every contract required that seal. My mother called exasperated, saying he accused everyone from the janitor to the CFO. I listened, nodded, and asked if he had checked his ego drawer. She didn't get the joke. When he finally found it months later, hidden among invoices he had ignored, he said the company had learned a valuable lesson about redundancy. I had learned one about patience. Charles used to tease me for how neatly I folded receipts. "It's like you're filing memories," he said. I told him some memories come with interest. Every bill I paid, every cent I saved, every calculation I memorized, it was all a quiet protest. I built my own accounts, my own name on documents, my own small world where my father had no signature. When Charles died years later, that system was what kept me upright. My father called 2 days after the funeral offering to help manage my finances. I said no. He said, "Don't be emotional." I said, "I'm being practical." The silence that followed was the cleanest break we had ever had. Looking back, I see my childhood not as a tragedy, but as a training program. He taught me control so I could eventually dismantle his. He taught me precision so I could see the flaws in his story. When people ask why I stayed calm in court, I think of that kitchen table, the bills, the pencil, the signature. Every line led back to him. There were moments of absurd humor, too. Once he insisted I return a Christmas sweater because it cost $30 more than the one he bought my brother. I returned it and used the refund to buy stock in his own company, 2 shares just to see if he would notice. He did. He called furious, shouting that I had no right to invest without consultation. I said I thought you wanted me to learn about responsibility. He slammed the phone down. Those shares tripled in value years later. I never sold them. Even now, I can hear his voice in small things, the sound of counting the rustle of envelopes, the way fluorescent lights hum in offices. He believed that fear kept people efficient. I discovered that humor kept them free. When he once accused me of lacking family loyalty, I told him loyalty should not require self-extinction. He said I was dramatic. I said I was his daughter. The irony is that he gave me every tool I later used against him. He taught me to document, to verify, to never rely on promises without proof. He told me stories about men who lost everything because they trusted emotion over math. I listened, memorized, and then turned the equation around. Years later, when I opened my own financial consultancy, I placed that old brass seal on the corner of my desk. It wasn't for use, it was for memory, a reminder that control only lasts until someone learns the same arithmetic. By the time he realized how much I had learned, it was already too late. He still believed he could shame me back into obedience, but I had spent decades turning every insult into capital. What he called stubbornness, I called compound interest. I think about that sometimes when people say money corrupts. Money doesn't corrupt. It reveals. It shows who fears scarcity and who creates it. My father's empire was built on scarcity, emotional, financial, moral. Mine would be built on something else. In the end, the lesson he tried to teach me became the one I taught him back, that the numbers do not care who is counting, only that they are counted correctly. It was early spring when my father appeared at my doorstep holding a pie. The crust was uneven, the filling too sweet, and he wore the same cologne he had used all my life, something sharp and old-fashioned that smelled like ambition and metal. He said family shouldn't fight over crumbs. I looked at the pie and said, "Then maybe you shouldn't bake with poison." He laughed too loudly, pretending the air between us had never been burned. Behind him stood Lydia, holding her phone at the perfect angle, sunlight catching her hair. "Just recording a sweet moment," she chirped. Her followers loved sincerity, even when it was counterfeit. Later that evening, she posted a clip titled, "Healing Over Pie" with the hashtag Family Trust Drama. She tagged the wrong account by accident or maybe on purpose, or cross-steal official my father's company. Within hours, employees were commenting under the post, speculating about money inheritance and betrayal. My phone buzzed through dinner. I poured another cup of tea and said nothing. The next morning, a local blog ran a piece about the Cross family trust feud. It quoted Lydia's tearful confession from TikTok. Some people think generosity ends at the wedding. The comments were predictable. Half of them accused me of being a greedy widow. The other half defended me as a feminist icon who had finally stood up to patriarchal theft. My father called at noon, his voice feigning calm. "This social media nonsense needs to stop," he said. I answered, "You started it when you brought her to my door." He sighed like a man tired of carrying the world. "I'm trying to keep the family together," I said, by monetizing it, and hung up. That week, the PR war began. Lydia posted a photo of herself crying beside a cup of coffee captioned, "When family forgets kindness." I waited exactly 30 minutes before posting a simple image on my own account, a cropped screenshot of a bank transfer, $5,000 from the Cross Trust to Lydia's name memo clothing allowance. No caption, no hashtags. Within the hour, her post vanished. The next day, she tried again with a different approach this time, a long video about forgiveness and misunderstanding. I replied with another receipt. this one showing a payment for content creation services. The internet began connecting the dots faster than she could delete them. Someone on Reddit wrote, "This woman is fighting with PowerPoint precision." I liked that comment. My father called again, furious. "Why are you humiliating her?" he demanded. "Because she's using your money to buy sympathy," I said. "Consider this brand awareness." He told me I was cruel. I told him cruelty was charging family for loyalty. He hung up. On the third day, Lydia went quiet. No posts, no stories, no curated tears. I thought maybe she had learned something. Then an article appeared on a gossip site showing her arriving at a charity gala wearing a new dress, the kind that costs more than a small car. The caption read, "Style through the storm." I almost admired her commitment to performance. I decided to send a gift. The next morning, a courier delivered a large white box to Lydia's address. Inside was an elegant bouquet of pink lilies tied with a satin ribbon. Beneath the flowers lay a folded sheet of paper and enlarged printout of her most recent bank statement. The balance circled neatly in red ink. The note read, "Apologies for the misunderstanding." "Transparency is healing." I signed it with my full name. By afternoon, a mutual friend texted me a photo of Lydia's face when she opened the box. Her expression was priceless, half rage, half disbelief. The friend wrote, "You're trending in the neighborhood group chat." That evening, my father showed up again, no pie this time. He stood in my doorway, face pale, saying Lydia was upset and that I had crossed a line. I looked at him and said, "I didn't cross it. I drew it." He followed me into the kitchen, pacing. "Do you want to destroy this family?" he said. "You did that when you started treating it like a company," I replied. He pointed a trembling finger at me, the same one he used to sign contracts. "You always twist things." I said, "You always hide things." For a moment, he softened. His voice turned almost pleading. "Evelyn, we're all human. We make mistakes." I leaned against the counter. "Then admit yours." He didn't. He never did. After he left, I opened my laptop and watched Lydia's last video again. She had titled it, "The Pain of Misunderstanding." The lighting was perfect, her tears framed like diamonds. I could tell she was reading from a script, probably one my father had approved. I closed the screen and whispered, "You two deserve each other." Then I poured the rest of the tea and smiled at how ordinary revenge could taste when brewed slowly. The next morning, a letter arrived from my father's lawyer. It was a formal notice about reassessing the management of shared assets. I read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in the same drawer where I kept the framed $0 check. My husband would have laughed. By the end of the week, Lydia's accounts were silent. No posts, no comments, no hashtags. I scrolled once more before bed, seeing only an old video of her holding a dog and talking about kindness. The comments section had turned against her. Someone wrote, "When you fake charity receipts, we'll find you." Another said, "That mother-in-law is my hero." I turned off the phone. The quiet felt different this time. Not like absence, but balance. I remembered my father's words at the door, "Families shouldn't fight over crumbs." He was right, though not the way he intended. Families like ours didn't fight over crumbs. We fought over control of the bakery. The next day, I baked my own pie, imperfect and uneven. I placed it on the table and cut a slice. It wasn't sweet, it was precise, and it was mine. 3 weeks after the silence settled, my father invited me to lunch at a downtown cafe I had not visited in years. The invitation came through his assistant, not his voice, which told me he wanted plausible politeness. When I arrived, Lydia was already there, smiling too brightly, her nails freshly done and painted in the shade of someone planning something. "We thought it was time to clear the air," she said. My father nodded, pretending to sip water. He placed a manila folder on the table. "This is just a formality," he said. "Our new financial advisor suggested some consolidation to simplify tax obligations." I looked at the folder. The label read, "Cross-Trust Reallocation." The words were sterile, the tone familiar. Lydia leaned closer, whispering, "You know how complicated these things get." Dad just wants transparency. Her calling him Dad made my skin crawl. I asked, "Who is the new advisor?" She smiled. "A friend of the family, very reputable." I said, "So reputable, he doesn't have a name." My father sighed. "Evelyn, please, you have been carrying too much. Let others handle the burden." I opened the folder. Inside was a signature page authorizing the transfer of $400,000 into a temporary holding account. I traced the line with my finger and asked, "Where is this account located?" Lydia answered too fast. "First National, same as always." I nodded slowly, then closed the folder. "Send me the full document digitally," I said. "I don't sign paper I haven't scanned." My father frowned. "You think everyone is trying to cheat you?" I said, "No. I think everyone is trying to rush me." Then I smiled, paid for my coffee, and left. That night, I called Amelia Reed, my lawyer and oldest friend. She listened without interruption, then said, "They're staging a setup. Let them. But make sure they step on your stage." She suggested I document every contact, every file, every signature request. And Evelyn, she added, "if you're going to play along, record the curtain call." The next morning, Lydia texted that she would drop by to collect the signed papers. I told her to come at noon. When she arrived, she wore beige again, the color of manipulation disguised as grace. She set her designer tote on the counter, pretending to check her phone. I excused myself to get tea. In that brief moment, I slipped an AirTag into the side pocket of her tote, next to a portable charger and a lip gloss. She thanked me for the tea she didn't drink, and left 5 minutes later, papers in hand, smile rehearsed. I waited until she drove away, then opened the tracking app. The signal blinked steadily, moving toward an office park near Matthews, about 40 minutes outside Charlotte. I followed. The building was new glass and chrome with a plaque that read, "Tri-State Advisory." I parked across the street and watched Lydia walk in, carrying the same tote. 15 minutes later, my father's car pulled up. He adjusted his tie in the mirror before stepping out. I snapped a photo, then another when he shook hands with a man in a gray suit waiting by the door. Amelia called while I watched. "Are you getting this?" she asked. "Every pixel," I said. Inside that office, according to later records, they were finalizing a transfer request under the assumption that I had already signed. The signature they used came from an old power of attorney form my father had kept from years ago, scanned and quietly altered. When I learned that later, I felt no shock, only confirmation. That day, though, I simply watched the two of them pose for deceit under fluorescent light. When they left, I followed at a distance. The AirTag pinged as Lydia's tote moved from the office to a cafe, then to a hotel lobby. She met a woman who handed her a white envelope. I took another photo. Then I drove home, printed the images, and sent them to Amelia with the subject line, "Accounting in progress." 2 days later, my father called, voice soft, pretending irritation. "You forgot to sign those forms," he said. "The advisor is waiting," I replied. "Then he can keep waiting." Lydia's voice echoed faintly in the background. "It's time-sensitive," she said. "Delays can be costly." I answered only for those who calculate badly. She hung up. He didn't. He muttered something about disappointment. I said, "Add it to the ledger." That evening, a courier arrived with a new folder labeled "Urgent Signature Required." I took it, signed it with a pen that had no ink, and returned it. The next morning, Amelia called laughing. "They submitted your signature to the bank." The inkless copy scanned as blank. The fraud flag triggered an alert. I smiled. Efficiency has its perks. Later that week, Lydia showed up again, feigning innocence. "There's been some confusion," she said, her tone fragile. "We thought the advisor sent you a confirmation." I said he didn't. She looked down, twisting her bracelet. "Must be an accident." I tilted my head. Accidents usually don't require fake offices. Her face flickered between guilt and defiance. I handed her an envelope. Inside was a printed invoice for $29.99, the price of the AirTag. The note read, "Tracking investments. Pays off." She blinked, lips parting, but no words forming. "What is this supposed to mean?" she asked. I said, "It means you should check your bag." She left quickly, nearly tripping over her heels on the way out. I watched from the window as she opened her tote by the car, finding the small white disc. Her expression shifted from confusion to terror to something like awe. Then she drove away faster than the speed limit allowed. That night, my father sent a brief email. "You are violating privacy laws," he wrote. I replied, "You are violating trust laws. Mine are federal." He didn't respond. Amelia called again, amused. "They just realized you caught them." "What do you plan to do?" I said. "Nothing yet. Let the silence work." She said, "Evelyn, sometimes silence is louder than fireworks." I told her, "Exactly." Over the next few days, I watched the story unfold quietly. The fake advisory office shut down. The man in the gray suit disappeared from LinkedIn. Lydia deleted more posts. My father began calling from unknown numbers that I never answered. Every ping from the AirTag felt like a heartbeat of justice. When the signal finally went dead, I knew they had destroyed it. I still smiled. Destroying evidence always leaves a trail. On Sunday, I baked another pie, this time blueberry. As it cooled on the counter, I opened my laptop and arranged the photos in a neat digital folder titled Asset Protection. Then I backed it up twice. Revenge, I had learned, was not an act, but a file management system. Before bed, I looked out at the quiet street. Somewhere out there, Lydia was explaining herself to my father, and he was realizing that control once lost cannot be repossessed. My phone buzzed with a message from Amelia. "Would you play dumb or play along?" I typed back, "Both," until they confused the two. I was drinking coffee when the email alert came through from the bank. The subject line said, "Unusual activity detected." I clicked it expecting a system error or some random fraud alert, the kind that disappears after one phone call. Instead, the page loaded slowly, showing a transfer I had not authorized. $240,000 withdrawn in two separate transactions labeled consulting fee for emotional support. The receiving account name read G. Cross and Lydia. For a moment, I thought it was a joke. Then I realized it was worse. It was family bookkeeping. I called the bank, and the young woman on the line spoke carefully, as if she could sense the temperature in my voice rising. "Mrs. Cross, these appear to be legitimate transfers from the trust." I said, "Next time he needs emotional support, tell him to invoice a therapist." She tried not to laugh, then apologized. I said it was fine. Laughter was better than pity. After I hung up, I opened the drawer where I kept my files, the one labeled Simply Proof. Inside were years of statements, contracts, receipts, every conversation reduced to numbers. I scanned the newest papers into a single folder. When I finished, I leaned back and stared at the ceiling fan turning above me. My mother's voice came back the way memories do when you are too tired to fight them. She used to say, "Trust the math, not the mouth." I never forgot that. She said it once after catching my father lying about a donation he had promised to the church. He wrote the check, then canceled it the next day, claiming the account was overdrawn. My mother didn't argue. She just showed the pastor the statement. My father didn't speak to her for a week. I looked again at the statement on my screen. Consulting fee for emotional support. It was almost poetic in the same way fraud is poetic when it pretends to be love. I wondered what kind of support Lydia provided to earn that much. Perhaps she listened to him complain about being misunderstood while she calculated her next handbag. I printed the transfer and highlighted the memo line in yellow. The absurdity almost made me smile. That night, I went through everything line by line. The trust had been leaking money for months, small amounts labeled as community donations, campaign expenses, advisory retainers. The amounts were precise enough to avoid suspicion, but frequent enough to create a pattern. My father had always been meticulous. He must have believed I would never check the details, but I had built a life on details. I found photos of Lydia at fundraisers for political candidates, always smiling in the background, always near a banner with my father's company logo. The donations matched the missing sums almost perfectly. It was not theft in the traditional sense. It was reputation laundering. He was buying influence with money that wasn't his. I opened a spreadsheet and began logging every inconsistency. It was tedious work, but it steadied me. Numbers don't lie. They only wait to be recognized. I traced the transactions across 3 accounts and 4 institutions. Every line confirmed what I already knew. Control was his currency, and he was spending it like it could buy forgiveness. When I finished, I sat back and whispered, "You should have taught me less." The next morning, I called Amelia and told her everything. She listened the sound of her typing steady. When I finished, she said, "You have more than a case. You have a pattern. Document it all. Send copies to every oversight board you can find. The North Carolina Financial Ethics Board loves patterns." I smiled at the way she said it, like she was already tasting the headline. I spent the rest of the day compiling. I scanned the bank statements, attached screenshots of Lydia's fundraiser posts, and added a note detailing the donation trail. I included the gray suit man's photo from Tri-State Advisory labeled Ghost Advisor. I even added a timeline of my father's campaign contributions, $30,000 spread across minor candidates, who all somehow mentioned tax reform and trust management in their speeches. It was a perfect circle of deceit drawn in neat ink. When I was done, I drafted the letter. It was not angry. It was clinical. I explained that I suspected financial misconduct within a private trust that affected multiple public entities. I wrote that the pattern showed possible violations of ethical finance laws. I ended with one sentence, "I am not seeking restitution. I am seeking accuracy." Then I signed my name. I printed everything, sealed the envelope, and placed it on the desk. For a moment, I thought of my father opening his own mail that morning, maybe humming, maybe believing he was still untouchable. I hoped the silence that followed the investigation would feel familiar to him, the kind he had given others for years. That evening, I watched the sunset from the porch. The light hit the edge of the lake just right, reflecting off the water like a coin tossed in slow motion. I thought again of my mother, of the way she used to balance her checkbook down to the last cent, smiling when the numbers aligned. She once said, "Harmony is when what you owe equals what you've learned." I finally understood. I wasn't angry. Anger is a wasteful currency. I was auditing. Every betrayal has an entry, every silence an interest rate. My father had taught me to count everything that mattered. Now I was counting what was left. I looked down at the envelope stamped and ready. Tomorrow it would go to Raleigh, addressed to the NC Financial Ethics Board. I whispered, almost amused, "Family consulting fee $0. Then I turned off the light, leaving only the steady hum of the ceiling fan and the quiet satisfaction that comes when the numbers finally make sense. I wasn't angry. I was accounting. The first hearing took place on a gray morning when the air outside the courthouse smelled of rain and disinfectant. Reporters waited near the steps, their microphones wrapped in plastic sleeves, ready to catch any hint of scandal. Inside the courtroom buzzed with low whispers. My father sat at the plaintiff's table wearing his usual navy suit and the self-assurance of a man who believed the law was still his ally. Lydia sat beside him, eyes lowered, pretending fragility. When the clerk called the case, my father rose, slowly steadying himself on the edge of the table. His voice carried across the room. "Your Honor," he began, "this entire ordeal is the result of an unstable widow mismanaging what remains of our family trust." The words hung in the air like smoke. I didn't flinch. I simply adjusted my glasses and waited. The Judge Whitaker glanced at me, then back at my father. "You are referring to your daughter, Mrs. Evelyn Cross." My father nodded. "Yes, she has become erratic, distrustful. She imagines wrongdoing where there is none." His lawyer leaned in, whispering lines rehearsed for weeks. Lydia dabbed her eyes with a tissue she didn't need. It was an old play performed for a new audience. When it was my turn, I stood slowly placing a thin folder on the lectern. "Your Honor," I said, "if we are discussing imagination, I would like to submit evidence that requires none." I opened the folder, revealing a printed image of the $240,000 transfer I had discovered weeks earlier. The courtroom projector displayed it on the screen. My father's name, Gerald Cross, and Lydia's appeared side by side on the same transaction line. Gasps rippled through the benches. Lydia's head snapped up. She forged that she shouted. I looked at her, then at the judge, and said evenly, "So?" Another forgery. Laughter broke out in the back rows. Even the bailiff's mouth twitched. Judge Whitaker cleared his throat sharply. Order. I waited for the room to quiet, then continued. Your Honor, this document came directly from the bank's fraud department. It includes timestamps, account metadata, and confirmation from the institution's security log. It's not a theory. It's arithmetic. I turned to my father. You taught me that numbers don't lie. He didn't meet my gaze. Lydia muttered something about misunderstanding, but the microphone caught every syllable. We didn't mean to transfer that money. It was a bookkeeping error. I tilted my head. An error that lasted 3 months. The judge gestured for me to proceed. Do you have additional exhibits, he asked. Yes, I said, just one more. A smaller example. I handed him a set of receipts neatly clipped together. These are spa invoices totaling $12,000 charged to the Cross Family Trust under corporate wellness. Lydia froze. The judge raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Cross, are these charges personal? I smiled faintly. Depends if Botox counts as corporate therapy. The room erupted again, louder this time. Even Whitaker's gavel struck twice before the laughter subsided. Lydia's cheeks flushed crimson. My father whispered something to her, but the microphones caught that too. Keep quiet. When the noise faded, I said calmly, For years, Your Honor. I believed my father's version of accountability. He said family loyalty meant silence. Today, I believe loyalty means transparency. I turned another page showing the timeline of donations and campaign contributions. This pattern aligns perfectly with funds leaving the trust. It's not only a betrayal of family, it may also be a violation of financial ethics laws. The judge leaned back his face, losing color. He adjusted his glasses and said, We will take these documents under review. My father's lawyer objected, claiming the evidence was prejudicial. It paints Mr. Cross unfairly, he said. I replied, The math painted him. I just brought it to light. The judge asked me to step down. I returned to my seat, the sound of heels clicking behind me like punctuation marks. Lydia tried to regain control, whispering to her lawyer, who whispered to my father. Their triangle of deceit folded inward smaller with each exchange. I could almost feel the structure collapsing. During the recess, reporters gathered outside the courtroom. Someone asked if I wanted to make a statement. I said numbers already did. Another reporter shouted, Mrs. Cross, do you regret bringing this to court? I looked at the cameras and said, ever been gaslighted, then proven right. Hit that like button. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel. It was communal. I had turned their language into mine. When court resumed, my father's lawyer tried to downplay the documents, calling them misinterpretations. He said I was emotionally compromised by widowhood. I let him finish, then rose again. Your Honor, if widowhood is a mental illness, then so is honesty. At least one of them leaves the books balanced. The judge sighed but didn't reprimand me. He asked the opposing counsel to present verifiable counterproof. They had none. Lydia fidgeted beside my father, tapping her nails on the table. At one point, she whispered, We can fix this. He didn't answer. His face was a map of disbelief, lines deepening with each page the judge turned. The hearing stretched into afternoon. When it ended, the judge ordered a temporary freeze on the trust until further review. My father's shoulders slumped for the first time in my memory. Outside, rain had started again, tapping against the courthouse windows. I walked past the reporters without stopping my umbrella steady in the wind. I didn't smile, but I didn't hide either. Every flash of the camera felt like a line drawn under the word closure. Later that night, Amelia called. You were magnificent, she said. Do you think they understood the weight of it? I said. They will when the audit begins. She laughed softly. You do realize you've become a folk hero online. I said justice sometimes trends before it settles. She paused, then added, You should rest. I looked out the window at the rain turning the streetlights into gold streaks. Rest is a luxury, I said. For now, I'll settle for balance. Before going to bed, I read through the transcript of the hearing one more time. The line that stood out wasn't mine or the judge's. It was my father's, recorded at the start, She's unstable. I smiled at the irony. Stability, after all, is just a matter of keeping your numbers straight. I closed the file, turned off the light, and slept without dreams. My father's counterattack arrived not through court documents, but through television. One morning, I turned on the local channel, and there he was on a talk show couch, smiling like a pastor selling redemption. The host leaned in and said, Mr. Cross, your daughter has accused you of financial misconduct. How do you respond? My father sighed dramatically. Evelyn is grieving, he said. She's confused. I love her dearly, but she's letting bitterness cloud her judgment. The audience nodded like a choir. He gestured with his hands, practiced humility wrapped in deceit. It's a tragedy when family lets lawyers replace love. Lydia sat beside him dressed in modest beige, nodding, as if forgiveness were her career. I watched with my coffee cooling, thinking how easily lies sound like comfort when spoken through a microphone. The host smiled sympathetically and said, We hope your family finds peace. My father said, So do we. That was when I decided to join the show silently. 2 days later, the same program aired a live call-in segment. I dialed in using the studio's public line and gave a false name. When they patched me through, the host said, We have a caller. What would you like to ask Mr. Cross? I lowered my voice. How do you spell embezzlement again? The pause that followed was delicious. Then the audience burst into laughter. Lydia froze. My father's face turned crimson, his smile cracking like paint in summer heat. The host coughed into his cue card, trying to recover. We appreciate your question, he said, moving to commercial. I hung up and let the silence between the segments do the work. Within hours, the clip was everywhere. Cross family caller strikes again became a meme. Someone slowed down the footage, adding dramatic music every time my father blinked. The internet divided into two camps, those defending the patriarch and those cheering for the widow who asked the perfect question. Talk radio debated whether humor counted as revenge. I didn't participate. I didn't need to. That evening, Amelia called laughing so hard she could barely breathe. You did not just do that, she said. I said I absolutely did. She replied, Half the city thinks you're an icon. The other half thinks you're a public service announcement. I told her I was fine with both. But behind the laughter came movement. The following morning, I received an anonymous envelope containing financial documents, copies of checks, donation slips, and internal memos from the Cross Foundation, my father's charitable front. The sender wrote only one sentence. If you want to know where the real money went, follow the community grants. I examined them closely. The pattern was familiar funds transferred to shell nonprofits, then redirected to political committees. The memo lines were written in the same looping handwriting I had seen on the spa receipts. He had turned charity into camouflage. I spent 2 days verifying the data, tracing the amounts through public disclosures and corporate registries. Each step confirmed the same truth. What he called generosity was a laundering system in plain sight. Amelia advised me to go beyond the ethics board this time. Send it to the forensic accounting unit, she said. They investigate when donations smell like detergent. I did exactly that. The package included every traceable trail of the Cross Foundation irregularities, labeled neatly signed with my full name. The media storm grew. Articles appeared questioning whether my father's philanthropy was genuine. Talk shows replayed the clip of the anonymous caller who spelled out the word that would not leave the public's mind. My father's attorney issued a statement claiming vindictive editing and malicious intent. The internet responded with a new phrase, malicious accuracy. Late one night, my phone buzzed with a message from Lydia. It was the first time she had written to me directly since the trial began. The text said, "We can fix this privately. Please, it's gone too far." I stared at the screen, imagining her sitting in a dark room lit by the glow of crisis, her hands trembling, not from guilt, but from exposure. I typed back, "So can a judge." Then I turned off the phone. The next morning, headlines announced that the Forensic Accounting Unit had opened a preliminary inquiry into the Cross Foundation. Reporters stood outside my father's building while he ignored every question. The host who once smiled at him now introduced the segment with a single word: accountability. Amelia called again, her tone steady this time. "You know they'll come after your credibility," she said. "They always do," I told her. "That's why I documented everything twice." She said, "Good, but Evelyn, be careful. He's dangerous when cornered." I answered, "So am I." That afternoon, I walked downtown, passing a billboard showing my father's face from the talk show, now overlaid with the word "under investigation." The world has a way of catching up to truth when given proper documentation. I bought a newspaper, folded it neatly, and slipped it into my bag. It felt like closure, written in ink. When I got home, there were 20 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I ignored them all. Instead, I poured a glass of water, opened the window, and let the sound of distant traffic replace the noise of the day. My father had always believed that reputation was stronger than evidence. He was wrong. Evidence writes its own press release. Before bed, I scrolled through the news one last time. Someone had posted a clip from the talk show again, slowed and captioned with the question I had asked, "How do you spell embezzlement again?" Underneath a comment read, "Justice has a sense of humor." I liked that one. I closed the laptop, turned off the lamp, and thought about the next hearing. My father would probably call it persecution. I would call it arithmetic. The second hearing drew a crowd that filled the hallway before the doors unlocked, and when we finally took our places, the room felt warm with breath and whisper the kind of public attention my father once loved and now feared. Reporters lined the back microphones clipped to the rail, and a cameraman balanced on the end of a bench like a patient bird. I sat beside Amelia, hands folded, while my father arranged his papers with theatrical care, and Lydia kept her chin down as if humility could be worn like a scarf. Judge Whitaker entered the room, rose and settled, and the clerk called our case with a voice that carried to every corner. My father rose first. "Your Honor," he said, "this matter has become tragic. My daughter is suffering what our family doctors believe is mental decline, heightened by grief, and she has turned her sorrow into suspicion." He paused for pity to arrive. "She sees conspiracy and bookkeeping betrayal in ordinary management, and her instability threatens what remains of our legacy." The words were measured like doses, designed to sound gentle as they cut. Lydia nodded solemnly at the floor. His attorney lifted a report like a trophy and said they would submit notes from a wellness specialist who had never met me. The courtroom tightened the way a room does when polite cruelty lands. Amelia stood slowly. "Your Honor, we object to speculation dressed as medicine. If we must discuss minds, we will start with memory." She gestured for me to approach the lectern. I carried a slim binder and the small remote that would control the courtroom screen. "Your Honor," I said, "since we are discussing recollection, I would like to introduce a witness and a document, with the court's permission." The judge adjusted his glasses. "Proceed." The side door opened, and Dr. Ruth Harris stepped in, a woman with gray hair pulled into a calm knot and a canvas folder against her chest. She introduced herself in a steady voice as a licensed psychologist who had treated my mother during the final years of her life. Counsel for the plaintiff shifted, surprised by a name they had not prepared to attack. I asked Dr. Harris a simple question. "Doctor, do you recall an incident in May of 2019 in which my mother was presented with an authorization form in my father's study?" She nodded. "Yes. She was anxious and confused by legal language and asked for time to review. Your father refused. He insisted it was routine. He told her the family needed it signed that day. I asked, did she understand the document? No, Dr. Harris said. She asked for clarification and was denied. He raised his voice and pressed the pen into her hand. She signed while crying. In my notes, I wrote that she described the experience as forced consent. My father's attorney objected, claiming hearsay and outrage in the same breath. The judge allowed the testimony for context and admonished us to keep to relevance. Amelia nodded. We will. She turned to the bench. Your Honor, that document was a power of attorney template later scanned and altered for financial use. We will submit the audit trail. The room murmured. Lydia shifted in her seat and pressed her fingers to her cheek, as if the heat there could be cooled with pressure. My father stared at Dr. Harris with the flat anger of a man who wants to erase a witness by wishing her smaller. I thanked the doctor and asked the bailiff to collect her notes for the record. Then I faced the screen. If the court will allow one brief visual. The projector buzzed to life, and the first slide appeared a simple image of a check with my father's bold signature. The payee line read, Friends of Whitaker Committee. The memo read, Community Outreach. The date fell midway through the last election cycle. The amount was not astronomical, but it was steady, and the next slide showed another and another, a pattern across months that would look innocent only if seen alone. The judge leaned forward and then leaned back as if distance would reduce the clarity. Amelia spoke softly. Your Honor, these payments coincide with withdrawals from the Cross Family Trust, marked as community donations and advisory retainers. We are not accusing the court of bias. We are presenting the material conditions of pressure. The judge's hand left his pen and then returned. With a small tremor, he tried to still by aligning the cap. My father's attorney objected again, color rising as he argued relevance charity, an unfair inference. I kept my voice even. The public has a right to know who funds influence. The family has a right to know when its assets pay the bill. Lydia raised her purse to shield her face from the nearest camera, then lowered it when a photographer changed angles. The slideshow ended on a ledger page, neat and unadorned, where columns met like a closing jaw. The judge cleared his throat and asked for copies. His voice was dry. I handed the binder to the clerk. The room was so quiet that the soft thud of paper on wood sounded like thunder far away. My father tried to reclaim the stage. Your Honor, he said, this is vindictive accounting by a woman who cannot accept that grief has impaired her judgment. He pointed at me with the same finger that had signed those checks and told the press last month that we should keep our family business private. I let the silence settle for a count of 3 the way Charles once taught me to let hot sugar cool before touching it. Then I spoke to the microphones as if to a single listener. Silence is not golden, it is evidence. The line dropped into the room and did not sink. It hung there, simple as gravity. Somewhere behind me, a hand clapped. Once then, many hands followed a soft wave that the bailiff quieted with a polite request for order. It did not feel like applause for a performance. It felt like relief. The judge looked toward the gallery with a warning glance and then back to the papers in front of him. His face had lost color in the way faces do when they remember a detail they would rather forget. He set his hands on the bench and then pulled them back to his lap. Amelia stepped in with the final piece. Your Honor, we request a formal audit of the trust and a referral of the donation pattern to the appropriate oversight. We also ask that management authority remain with Mrs. Cross until the conclusion of the inquiry. The opposing counsel began to argue, but their words arrived without weight. The judge requested a recess. When he stood, his chair scraped the floor in a sound that made Lydia flinch. During the break, the corridor swelled with questions. A reporter asked if I intended to ruin my father. I said I intended to balance the accounts. Another asked if I was proud of today. I said pride is a luxury accuracy, a duty. When we returned, the judge read a short order. The trust would remain frozen, an independent audit would proceed, and the donation materials would be transmitted to state review. He added that any further personal commentary from counsel would be unwelcome. My father sat down hard. Lydia turned away from the cameras and lifted a hand to shield her eyes as if the room had become too bright. In the gallery, a woman whispered that she wished her own mother had lived to see this day. I thought of mine and of the pen pressed into her shaking fingers in 2019, and of the note in Dr. Harris's file that used the phrase, "forced consent," with medical restraint. I thought of how long a family can live with a page turned to the wrong chapter because no one dares to flip it. The clerk marked the docket. The gavel fell once. People rose as the judge left, but he did not glance toward either table. He walked out, holding his hands together, as though keeping them still required both. Amelia exhaled. "Well done," she said, quiet enough that only the wood heard. I closed the binder. My father stared at the opposite wall, not at me. Lydia said something I could not hear, and then pressed her lips together the way children do to stop them from trembling. We stepped into the corridor, and the lights felt louder there, humming above the marble. I gave no speech. I made no victory pose. I simply walked toward the steps and the waiting air, the door swinging closed behind me, like a book that finally knew how it would end. The order came on a clear afternoon when the courtroom glowed with thin squares of light, and every breath seemed to wait for permission. We rose as the judge returned, eyes lowered to the order that would decide what months of noise could not. His voice was firm. The court recognizes Mrs. Evelyn Cross as the sole manager and beneficiary of the trust assets and confirms her full authority over all related property and accounts. A hush fell, then a ripple of whispers, of, "My father did not turn." Lydia stared at the grain of the table as if it could open and swallow her. The judge added that referrals would be made for possible violations involving donations and the misuse of charitable funds, and that a separate inquiry into document alterations would proceed with the district attorney. He set down his pen. The sound was small and final. I breathed without moving. Years of accusation resolved into one sentence that did not need to shout. The clerk read the order again for the record. Amelia's hand touched mine once, then lifted a reminder that the win belonged to the evidence, not to applause. My father stood carefully as though gravity now charged interest. His lawyer whispered strategies that sounded like dust sliding over glass. Lydia turned toward me with sudden urgency. "We were just protecting the family," she said. "By robbing it," I answered. The bailiff opened the gate. People rose. Judge Whitaker left through the side door without lifting his eyes, his hand smoothing the robe with a tremor he tried to hide. I gathered my binder and walked the aisle like a person leaving a service that had finally told the truth. In the corridor, the questions began. How much was the estate? Will you forgive him? What happens next? I said the numbers will speak and I will not translate them anymore. Outside, the cameras opened and closed like bright mechanical insects. The air felt rinsed. Amelia joined me beneath the stone arch. "You did what you came to do," she said. "Now let the audits complete the sentence." I nodded, and for a single heartbeat saw my mother at the top of the stairs, the small wave she used when she wanted me to know she had seen me. Then the day moved. I went home. The Charlotte Observer posted first. Heiress outsmarts her family in 3.8M courtroom twist. The headline was louder than my mood, but true enough to stand. A former accountant at my father's foundation emailed to say investigators had asked for files and that he would cooperate. A donor wrote to ask whether her gift had been real. I forwarded both notes to Amelia with one word: logged. The evening news recapped the check images, the dates that matched the trust withdrawals, and the spa invoice that had begun as a joke and ended as a map. Calls to my father were unanswered on air. The anchor used the phrase, "ongoing investigation," with careful hands. At dusk, Lydia arrived at my gate. The gloss was gone. Her hair was pinned back like a flag of truce. "Evelyn, please," she said. "We can talk." We were overwhelmed. We never meant harm. I answered through the speaker. "I am not accepting visitors." She tried again. "I want to apologize. I will do whatever you ask. "I will take that in writing," I said, "preferably notarized." She blinked as if the word alone carried weight. "Please, this is my life." "Mine too," I said, and ended the call. She stood there while the sky erased her expression, then left. Night fell without ceremony. I ate at the kitchen table and left the binder closed beside my plate. The lake turned the color of ink. 2 frogs started their plain duet among the reeds. In the morning, news vans idled by the curb. I made coffee anyway. The world keeps its own clock. The district attorney's office sent its first notice confirming a preliminary review of possible forgery. I forwarded it to Amelia and asked for a quiet hour. At noon, a single-line email arrived from my father. "This is not final." I did not reply. Some entries do not deserve ink. A neighbor brought clippings and a casserole that tasted like kindness. She said her mother would have loved my answer about numbers. I thanked her and thought that kindness is the only currency that never devalues. Later, I met Amelia to map the next steps. Auditors will want everything she said. "Good," I said. "Everything is the point." On my way out, a young associate said his grandmother had mailed me a card. "Tell her I will spend it well if it contains wisdom," I said, and he laughed softly. Back home, I opened the windows. Light walked across the room like a slow visitor. Silence did not feel empty. It felt accurate. My phone buzzed after sunset. Lydia again, voice thin. She said the staff had been contacted, the gray suit advisor was gone, my father had locked his door. "We were just protecting the family," she repeated, as if repetition could buy a different balance. "You were protecting an illusion," I said. "Families are not empires. They are ledgers of kindness and debt, and you kept drawing from the wrong column." She cried quietly. Then the line died. Near midnight, I sat on the porch with a blanket. An owl called from the trees. The lake held the moon like something owed and finally paid. The next morning brought the first subpoena with my name as custodian of records. I placed it beside the binder. The pages looked calm. I felt calm. I thought of Charles and the gentle joke he would have made about interest and patience. I thought of my mother and the way she said, "A balanced ledger is a resting soul." The mail came. The neighbor's cat crossed the lawn as if it owned the grass. Somewhere a judge studied his reflection. Somewhere my father counted losses he once called love. I rinsed my cup and set it to dry. The Observer headline on the table caught a last stripe of sun and brightened again, a final bar of music held until the room learned its tune. Evening closed like a book that had always known where it would end, and the house let out the breath it had saved, and so did I. I slept deeply for the first time in months, and morning arrived simple and precise again. 2 months later, the hospital smelled like antiseptic and lemons, a clean brightness that tried and failed to disguise the exhaustion of the ward. I signed in, clipped a visitor badge to my lapel, and followed a nurse down a corridor where the ceiling lights hummed like tired bees. My father looked smaller in the bed, as if the linens had negotiated away his height. The television above him played the new news without sound, a banner crawling across the bottom that mentioned investigations like weather. He looked at me, and for a moment I saw the same calculation I had known all my life, searching for a foothold in this new terrain. Then it softened. "Money is just paper," he said, voice thinned by the oxygen line. I took the chair and placed my purse on my knees. "Then consider this origami," I said, setting a white envelope on the tray. Inside was a check for $1 dated that morning, signed in steady ink. His eyes narrowed. "You are mocking me," he said. "I am setting a price for closure," I answered, a token to mark the end of a very long invoice. He looked past me toward the window where a sycamore branch knocked politely against the glass. He shifted, wincing, and the monitor made a sound that reminded me of a metronome correcting a sloppy pianist. "I am sick," he said. I know I answered. He waited for a different sentence. None arrived. He tried another door. "We could repair this," he said. "Families survive worse. They survive truth," I said. "They do not survive theft dressed as love." His breath fluttered, and for a moment I feared he might cry, not from regret, but from frustration at a world that no longer surrendered to his will. He glanced at the envelope again. "What would you have me do with that?" he asked. "Fold it," I said. "Practice humility." He swallowed, eyes glassy. "You always wanted the last word," he said. "No," I answered. "I wanted the accurate one." A nurse stepped in to check a line and then slipped out like punctuation. The television changed to a segment about a community food drive. I watched a man load boxes into a van and wondered how many donations in my father's ledger had ever fed anyone except his reputation. He cleared his throat. "Your mother would not approve of this," he said. "My mother would want the numbers to match the truth," I answered, "and the numbers have finally learned how to speak." He closed his eyes, and the tendons in his hand rose like quiet ropes under old skin. When he opened them, the fight had moved back behind the pupils, smaller now but stubborn. "You think you have won," he said. "I think the books are balanced," I said. He turned his head to the window. The sycamore leaf held for a second against the pane and then fell, tracing a small green arc that ended out of sight. He said nothing more. I adjusted the blanket on his shoulder and left the check where he could see it each time he changed his mind. At the door I paused. "For what it is worth," I said, "I hope the people around you are kind." He did not answer. The hallway felt longer on the way out, as if leaving required more distance than arriving. I returned the badge, stepped into the bright parking lot, and let the October sun find my face. In the car, I checked my phone. There was an email from Lydia with the subject line "Opportunity." The message was short and frantic. She wrote that she had resigned from her last position, that she admired the mission of the Cross Foundation for Women's Financial Recovery, and that she would love to contribute to meaningful work. She attached a resume so polished it squeaked and added a final line. "I hope we can put the past behind us." I forwarded the email to Amelia with a single note. "Best reference. Exhibit B forgery." Amelia replied within minutes. "Perfect." I closed the phone and drove home with the windows down, the air cool enough to make me feel awake. The lake was bright gulls carving chalk lines across the sky. I brewed tea and read the news. Investigators had requested additional files from the foundation. A former board member was cooperating. Commentators debated whether public disgrace could ever rehabilitate private character. I answered none of them. The foundation office buzzed with restrained energy that week. We processed grant applications from women rebuilding after financial abuse. We approved a program to teach high school seniors how to read loan contracts without panic. We stocked a community closet with secondhand business clothes and a rack of new notebooks. The small acts felt like interest on a debt paid forward. On Thursday, Lydia called and left a message. I heard the shape of performance in her voice and the tremor of fear underneath. She said she had learned from her mistakes that she wanted to help others avoid them. That redemption and work made a beautiful pair. I deleted the message and returned to the spreadsheet on my screen. Numbers do not respond to apologies. They respond to correction. 2 days later, a bouquet arrived at the office with a cream card. "Thank you for considering me," it said. I placed the flowers in the lobby and forwarded the receipt to Amelia with a note that simply said, "Logged." Late that afternoon, I visited the hospital again. My father was asleep, the television showing a documentary about bridges. He looked like a man crossing his own. I left a copy of the foundation's brochures on the tray beside the check. Maybe he would read it. Maybe not. In the elevator down, a volunteer in a red vest asked if I needed directions. I said no. I knew the way out. Sunday brought a steady rain that made the house feel careful. I cooked, wrote thank you notes to donors, and ironed a blouse that had not needed attention but now looked ready for responsibility. Michael called from a halfway point between apology and ambition. He asked if there was room for him to help at the foundation. I said yes, with conditions. 6 months, no salary. Full days learn to listen before speaking. He agreed too quickly, then slower when he realized I meant every word. After the call, I sat with the quiet and thought about lineage. Families are not chains. They are choices arranged over time. On Monday, the district attorney's office emailed an update. Preliminary charges against Lydia would be considered after review of digital signatures and communications. My fingers hovered over the keyboard and then moved. Thank you for the notice. Please advise when additional documents would assist. I attached a folder titled Exhibit B and felt a small, exact satisfaction settle behind my ribs. That evening, Amelia sent a message that simply read, "Well played." I poured a glass of water and stepped onto the porch. The rain had cleared. The sky was the pale blue of paper waiting for ink. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere, a printer spit out a new request for records. My phone buzzed again with a final email from Lydia that said, "I really am sorry." I typed one sentence, then be accurate. I pressed send, turned off the porch light, and went inside to sleep as if rooms could learn new shapes once you rearranged the furniture. The dollar check sat in the hospital tray by my father's bed. I imagined a nurse moving it to dust the surface, glancing at the amount, and smiling at the oddness of such a small figure surrounded by so many machines. Money is just paper, he had said. I had agreed with an edit. Paper can be folded to carry meaning. Some folds are birds, some are boats, some are receipts. The first morning of the Cross Foundation for Women's Financial Recovery began not with a ribbon cutting, but with the hum of an old printer and the smell of coffee slightly burnt in the break room. I had rented a modest space near uptown Charlotte, a converted insurance office with frosted windows that now bore a new name in careful lettering. The mission was simple: to help women who had been deceived, manipulated, or drained by those who claimed to love them, to restore both money and trust in themselves. The staff was small, 6 women in their 30s to 50s, all with stories that would have made the evening news if shame had not silenced them. A former accountant whose husband had erased her savings, a teacher whose brother had forged her signature on a mortgage, a nurse who paid her boyfriend's credit card debt only to find it was never his card. I hired them as interns and told them the salary would grow as the foundation did. They looked relieved not by the pay, but by the premise that their experience mattered. The first project was to create a financial literacy workbook using plain language and real examples. We called it Balancing Again. We tested every chapter on one another. When the page about hidden joint accounts made one of them cry, we stopped, made tea, and kept editing. Michael arrived the second week contrite but composed. He stood in the doorway of my office with the nervous posture of a man entering a confessional. "I would like to help," he said. "I want to rebuild what we lost." I looked up from a spreadsheet. "There will be no salary for 6 months," I said. "You will supervise logistics, manage volunteer schedules, and learn why paperwork is a sacred trust." He nodded too quickly. "That sounds fair." "You will feel broke?" I added. He smiled, uncertain. "I already do." "Then congratulations," I said. "That's financial literacy, dear." He laughed despite himself, and something eased between us. The foundation grew faster than expected. Local papers covered the workshops, and donations began to arrive in envelopes with handwritten notes. One came from a woman in her 70s who wrote, "I watched your story on television. My late husband left me debt. Thank you for proving honesty can still win." Inside was a check for $50. It meant more than all the large ones. I framed the note on the office wall. We used the first major grant to fund free accounting consultations for widows managing estates for the first time. The sessions filled instantly. One afternoon, I walked past the training room and heard laughter, the kind that comes only when shame begins to dissolve. A woman was explaining how she had discovered her late partner's secret loans and then corrected every mistake line by line. She said it felt like sweeping glass from her own floor. I thought of my mother's phrase, "Trust the math, not the mouth." Michael learned quickly. He organized volunteers, managed the storage closet, and handled donations with the seriousness of a surgeon. He began to understand that money was not the enemy, but the mirror of responsibility. One evening, he handed me a stack of receipts for a community fair and said, "I finally see why you record everything. Memory lies. Numbers don't." I nodded. That realization was worth more than any paycheck. By autumn, we had enough surplus to announce the Evelyn Cross Fund, an emergency grant for victims of financial fraud. We pledged $100,000 to start. Reporters asked if it was revenge money. I told them it was conversion. A bad investment turned into a dividend of good. The press liked that line, but I meant it literally. Every dollar stolen from me had taught me how to give with precision. The foundation hosted a dinner that November, simple and bright, catered by a local cafe. Volunteers decorated the tables with paper cranes folded from old bank statements. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. During the event, one of the interns named Carla stood to speak. She told how her ex-husband had convinced her to co-sign a business loan, drained their joint account, and disappeared. Now she was the foundation's bookkeeper, reconciling other women's ledgers with the calm of a priest. The room applauded. I caught Michael watching her with admiration. Later, he said, "It feels like we are doing something sacred." "We are," I said. "We are proving that integrity compounds. Not everything ran smoothly. Bureaucracy had its claws. Permits, audits, and endless forms tested our patience. But each challenge felt cleaner than any comfort built on deceit." I kept a small notebook labeled "Lessons Paid For." The first entry read, "Never sign what you don't read." The second, "Kindness is credit." The third, "Balance before trust." By the end of the year, the notebook was half full. On Christmas week, we received an anonymous donation, a cashier's check for $20,000 with the memo for those rebuilding after betrayal. Amelia suspected it came from one of the businessmen my father had once charmed. I smiled and said maybe guilt had matured into generosity. We deposited it anyway. The board agreed to allocate it toward a scholarship program for single mothers studying accounting. We named it after my mother. The announcement drew local media again, and a reporter asked how it felt to see my family's name restored to honor. I answered that honor had not been lost, only misplaced, and we had found it in the arithmetic of compassion. Michael completed his 6 months and came into my office on the final day. "I think I'm ready for a salary now," he said, half joking. "Are you ready for the responsibility that comes with it?" I asked. He nodded. "I believe so." I looked at the ledger. "Then you will start at the standard intern rate for 3 months with review at the next audit." He laughed, realizing that accountability was hereditary too. That night, I walked through the empty office before locking up. The desks were tidy, the whiteboard full of goals. On the shelf sat the first copy of Balancing Again Corners, curled from use. Outside, the city lights reflected on the glass, layering my reflection with theirs, until I could not tell which one belonged to me. I thought of my father in the hospital, the check on his tray, the bridge documentary still looping in silence. Maybe redemption was not a single act, but a series of reconciled columns across generations. Before leaving, I turned off the lights and whispered a small prayer, not of forgiveness, but of gratitude. Justice had done its work. Revenge had been translated into reform. The arithmetic was complete. The past no longer owed me interest. When I stepped outside, the air smelled of winter rain and new beginnings, and for the first time in years, I felt that balance could also mean peace. 1 year later, the ballroom of the Charlotte Civic Center glittered beneath chandeliers that had witnessed too many promises and not enough proof. I stood at the edge of the stage, fingers resting on a note card I would never need to read. The plaque in front of me read, "Integrity in Finance Award," its engraved letters catching the light like the reflection of something steadier than pride. The audience waited with the kind of attention that feels heavier than silence. When the applause quieted, I began. "Justice is not loud," I said. "It is consistent. It does not shout to be heard. It writes its own echo in every account, balanced every truth that survives noise." People nodded, and for a moment the entire room breathed in rhythm. I spoke about the women at the foundation, the work they had done, the stories they had rewritten. I mentioned no names from the past, only lessons. Accountability is not revenge, I said. It is repair. When I finished, the audience rose clapping in a rhythm that sounded like relief. Backstage, the air was cooler. A journalist with a press badge approached, recorder in hand. "Congratulations, Mrs. Cross. May I ask one more question for the feature?" I smiled. "Of course." He leaned forward. "After everything, what did your father teach you?" I looked at the floor for a moment, then back at him. "He taught me how to count money. I just counted better." The reporter blinked, realizing the quote would outlive the article. He thanked me and turned away, already typing. I exhaled slowly, the laughter quiet but certain inside my chest. Outside, the city hummed. The billboard near the courthouse had been replaced with one advertising community grants, a quiet monument to what had changed. The Cross Foundation now operated in 3 states. Carla managed the new office in Raleigh. Michael, finally salaried, had become a meticulous director of outreach. He teased me once, saying, "You built an empire from honesty." I corrected him. "Not an empire, a ledger that never lies." Later that night, after the banquet, I drove alone to Lake Norman. The water shimmered under a quarter moon, gentle ripples brushing the dock. I slipped off my shoes and sat at the edge, letting the chill travel through my feet into the wood. The sound of crickets filled the distance between one thought and the next. I remembered the courtroom, the faces, the noise. I remembered the hospital, the $1 check still resting in a drawer somewhere. I thought of my mother's hands teaching me to fold napkins into perfect halves, saying symmetry makes peace. I realized she had been teaching me accounting long before numbers entered my life. My phone buzzed. A message from Amelia. "You did it, Evelyn. Proud of you." I typed back, "We did it," then set the phone aside. From the porch of a nearby cottage, an old radio played jazz notes floating across the lake like conversation carried by wind. I thought about consistency again, how the best melodies repeat until they become truth. Justice is the same way. It is not a crescendo. It is a rhythm that endures. The following morning, I visited the foundation office. The staff had hung a banner that read, "Congratulations, Evelyn," in looping gold script. Michael insisted on a small toast with sparkling cider. "To integrity that pays interest," he said, lifting his glass. "To math that heals," I added. Laughter scattered around the room. Someone snapped a photo. It would probably end up framed near the first dollar we ever raised. That afternoon, I opened the mail and found a letter from a woman in Texas. She wrote that after watching our story, she had finally reported her husband's hidden accounts and had started her own financial recovery group. Her closing line read, "You gave me permission to keep my own signature." I sat for a moment holding the paper, feeling the quiet weight of what stories can do. The past no longer hurt. It informed. Evening brought a soft rain. I stood by the window of my office watching drops trace clear lines down the glass and thought about how transparency in every sense makes beauty visible. I glanced at the framed quote above my desk, "Accuracy is respect." It had started as a private reminder, now it was the Foundation's motto. Before locking up, I recorded a short message for the Foundation's online page. My voice was calm even. To everyone watching, I said, "Remember this. Truth does not need to compete. It just needs to persist." Then, as always, I added the closing line that had become my quiet signature. If you have ever been underestimated, subscribe for stories where the truth always wins. The red recording light blinked off. The office lights dimmed behind me. The rain eased into mist. The city's reflection stretched across the wet pavement like a ledger closed in perfect balance. I walked to the car, the award plaque wrapped in its blue folder, and thought finally, this was not the end of a story. It was the start of proof. The house by Lake Norman had grown quiet in the way that feels earned. Mornings began with the sound of geese cutting across the water and ended with the rustle of wind moving through pines. I lived there alone, but not lonely. The Foundation ran itself, now guided by people who understood its pulse. I had learned to replace urgency with steadiness. The calendar was lighter. The air cleaner, the days unremarkable in the best possible way. Most evenings I sat by the window with tea and watched the lake shift from gold to gray to the deep blue of memory. The reflections never stayed the same, yet the surface always found its calm again. One night in early spring, the postman left a package at the gate. The handwriting on the envelope was tight-controlled familiar. Inside was a letter 5 pages long written on lined paper in a looping cursive that trembled near the edges. Lydia's words began with apology and ended with exhaustion. She wrote about the sleepless months, the questions from investigators, the humiliation of public trials. She said she had lost everything she once pretended to own and finally understood the difference between money and worth. The last paragraph said she prayed that someday I could forgive her, not because she deserved it, but because carrying anger was its own kind of theft. I read it slowly, the way one examines a ledger before closing the book for good. Then I walked outside. The night was clear, a faint mist hovering above the lake. I tore the pages into small strips and placed them in the iron bowl by the porch. The flame caught quickly, curling the edges into light. The ashes lifted, dissolved, and disappeared into the water beyond the rail. Interest paid in full, I whispered not as vengeance, but as balance. The past no longer owed me. It had been reconciled. I went back inside, poured another cup of tea, and turned on the news. The anchor's voice announced what felt like a punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence. Judge Whitaker officially resigns amid ethics inquiry. I smiled, a quiet one, the kind that belongs only to those who have waited for time to finish the work justice started. The reporter continued saying the resignation letter cited personal reasons and a desire to restore public trust. The irony was unintentional and perfect. I switched off the television and let the room fill with silence again. Outside, the moon drifted above the water, and for a moment it looked like a silver coin placed gently on glass. I thought about how every story eventually reduces to reflection, how even the hardest arithmetic ends in symmetry. I stepped onto the porch again. The air smelled of rain that had not yet arrived. The lake held its breath. Somewhere across the shore, a dog barked once, then stopped as if agreeing that the world had said enough for the night. I closed my eyes and listened to the faint hum of the house, the steady tick of the old wall clock, the soft creak of the boards beneath my feet. It all sounded like peace, written in ordinary sounds. I thought about my father, not with anger, but with distance, the way one remembers a language they no longer speak. I hoped he had found some fragment of humility in the quiet hours of whatever remained for him. Forgiveness was no longer my project. It was his. My own work was finished. The foundation would continue to grow, women would learn to defend their names on paper and in life, and the world would keep turning its pages toward truth. I sat down, folded my hands, and looked toward the horizon, where the first hint of dawn softened the line between water and sky. The reflection shimmered, then steadied, a perfect mirror of what survival looks like after the noise fades. Some inherit money, others inherit courage. I had inherited both and used one to protect the other. The light brightened, tracing a narrow path across the lake toward the porch where I sat. I watched until the sun rose high enough to erase the boundary between reflection and reality. The day began again, simple, precise, and balanced.